The Exegesis of Empire. Philosophy, Episode 11. The Sophists, Part 2. Hippias, Antiphon, Thrasymachus, Euthydemus, and Dionysodorus. The last Sophists. On the 5 remaining Sophists and their place in the movement. Time for the final 5 Sophists before we get into Socrates and Plato. If we knew very little of the pre-Socratics, we knew even less about Protagoras, Gorgias, and Prodicus. Here, with these last 5, we know even less than those. Their inclusion in the project is still important in that they both were a massive influence on Socrates and Plato, despite them being heavily critical on the Sophists, and because of their inclusion in Plato's many dialogues. However, since we know little about them, I will keep these relatively brief. Hippias of Elis. Hippias was born sometime around 460 BC, which would have made him just younger than Socrates and Prodicus. He was born in Elis, the capital city on the northwest Peloponnesian city-state of the same name. All we really know about Hippias is that he traveled around Greece selling his services and teaching students for a cost. Hippias was respected by many but scorned by those like Socrates due to his massive intellectual ego. Hippias's, that is. In one of the 2 Platonic dialogues named after Hippias, Hippias Minor and Hippias Major, Hippias stated that he could, quote, expound on any subject on which he had a lecture prepared and answer any questions, end quote, from Hippias Minor. In the other, he claimed knowledge of astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, the art of letters, including syllables, rhythms, and intonations, immense knowledge of history and myth, and the perfect method of study and memorization, all these from Plato's Hippias Major. And in the former, he also claimed to be a master of various arts and crafts, such as engraving rings, cobbling shoes, weaving clothing, braiding leather, writing speeches and poems, and so on. All of this must be taken with a grain of salt, given 1, Plato and Socrates already had a massive bias against the Sophists, though often for a good reason, and 2, these are not historical accounts of Hippias, but artistic ones that allowed Plato to characterize the Sophists in any manner he chose. Nonetheless, there is often truth to fiction, so even if his ego and his breadth of knowledge weren't as extreme as presented in these 2 dialogues, there was likely still some validity. Because of his breadth of knowledge, and because we know he was a sophist, this would have given Hippias a massive student and customer base. Whereas Protagoras focused on arguments and debates, Gorgias focused on speeches, and Prodicus focused on language, Hippias would have been able to sell his teachings on all of these and more. In regard to Hippias's philosophy, for, like the other sophists so far, Hippias did participate in this field as well, he was known for his distinction and debate between nomos and physis, also known as customs of mankind versus those of nature and reality, respectively. His main contention was that natural law took precedence over physical law, asking, quote, how can anyone take laws seriously or believe in them when often the same people who established them repeal them and change them, end quote. He believed that due to the fact that many of the same laws were set down in every nation without the communication between nations, i.e., obedience to parents or laws against certain acts of violence, that natural laws, likely derived by the gods, existed and should be respected more than the ever-changing laws of man. However, this allows for an immense gray area. His observations of what he would have considered natural or divine law would only take evidence from nations or states which he knew of. This could lead to possible misrepresentations of what constitute this natural law. Similarly, it is likely that if Hippias or other like-minded philosophers/sophists found nations with alternative customs, say African or Asian nations, they would not take alternative customs of their natural law into account and would demonize these populations instead. Therefore, it is not just natural law which Hippias deems more important, even though that is what he states. It is law that is, quote-unquote, natural, familiar, and that which he would agree with. But either way, even if none of these possible negatives proved true, his belief in the superiority of natural law could lead to unwritten laws to triumph over written laws, potentially allowing loopholes in regard to crime or corruption. We could easily see this today when certain nations equate religious practices as a justification for egregious acts of violence, for the refusal to separate the majority party's religious law from the state law itself, and so on. Hippias, finally, was known for his continuity theory. However, I will leave this one until the analysis of his Platonic dialogue, since it plays a large part there, and it is not necessary to know in order to understand him as a sophist. Antiphon of Athens. Antiphon of Athens is also commonly referred to as Antiphon the Sophist, due to various men named Antiphon existing in Athens at the same time. Some consider the sophist to be the same man as Antiphon the orator, and some, though far fewer, consider him to be the same as Antiphon the poet. However, all we know for certain is that he lived sometime in the later part of the 5th century BC, meaning he was born around the time of our previous sophists and worked contemporarily to them. Two of Antiphon's works remain in fragments and testimonies. First, On Concord, and second, On Truth. The former, On Concord, is a series of aphorisms similar to the Stoic variety, taking on topics such as education. Quote, "There is nothing more important for men than education. After all, it is the kind of seed one sows in the ground that determines the kind of products one should expect." End quote. Marriage. Quote, "And it obviously follows from this that even a compatible wife provides a man with just as much affectionate attention and trouble as he gives himself, since now he has to think of the health of two bodies. Now then, suppose they have children." End quote. Desire and restraint. Quote, "The man who has never desired or experienced anything base and bad is not a man of restraint because he has never had to master anything to compose himself." End quote. Distraction. Quote, "Some people do not live the life they have, but thoroughly occupy themselves with plans." End quote. Cowardice. Quote, "A coward is someone whose tongue is full of confidence and whose will pushes him forward when the danger is absent and impending, but draws back when faced with the actual event." End quote. Friendship. Quote, "People with friends often fail to recognize them and go around instead with those who flatter wealth and fawn on good fortune." End quote. Time. Quote, "It is impossible to take back one's life like a move at backgammon." End quote. On top of these, he provides aphorisms and advice for topics like social norms, natural law, acts of violence, illness, passing the torch, life itself, greed, and so on. His second work, what we have remaining of it at least, On Truth, provides a clearer train of philosophical thought which logically develops from beginning to end. He begins by, like many pre-Socratics before him, from Xenophanes to Diogenes, stating that, quote, "People believe what they see with their eyes more than they do those things, the evidence for whose genuine existence comes from what is unseen." End quote. The senses are not enough to truly comprehend the world without doubt, but where he takes us with this is entirely different than where the pre-Socratics and other sophists have taken us before, saying that, quote, "There is nothing at all in our constitutions to differentiate foreigners and Greeks, for we all breathe the air through our mouths and nostrils, laugh when our minds feel pleasure, or cry when we are distressed. We hear sounds with our ears, we see with our eyes thanks to daylight, we work with our hands, and walk with our feet." End quote. All things which the Greeks at the time had heard, learned, and seen established a supposed difference between them and the foreigners around them. However, these things which they had heard, learned, and seen are biased and purely derived from the senses, not through logical thought. Logical thought would, as Antiphon here stated, lead to the conclusion that customs and practices are derived within communities and nations, leading to the conclusion that the Greeks' customs and beliefs are no more valid than another nation's. This is one of the most revolutionary views on foreigners, or what they would have called barbarians, of the time. It's an acceptance of people who one may not readily know or know about, of those with different customs, beliefs, traditions, and so on, something that many today would do well to remember. Finally, one of the most controversial of Antiphon's ideas is his distinction between nomos and physis. With Hippias above, we learned that the distinction between nomos and physis was that between man-made customs/laws and natural laws. Hippias believed in the superiority of natural law. While Antiphon believes the same thing, he also believes that we should only, quote, "treat the man-made laws, nomos, as important when the other people are present, but when there is nobody else with you, to value the demands of nature, physis." End quote. In other words, societal laws should be followed in order for one to be accepted by one's fellow man, but should be ignored for the more powerful and just natural laws when others are not watching. This, as with Hippias's thought on nomos and physis, has much gray area. This ties into Antiphon's previous idea in that he is well aware that customs and thus laws change across cultural lines, therefore proving that they are not inherently the perfect or proper path forward to run a country or society. However, this begs the question: how do we possibly define natural law? Wouldn't one society find a certain law to be natural where another would not? Antiphon and Hippias would probably state that natural law is universal, but how do we prove this? In conclusion, Antiphon, despite being categorized as a sophist, does feel as if he is more along the lines of a traditional philosopher. However, his interest in the use of rhetoric, along with his teaching practices, leads him to be categorized as a sophist. Overall, his contributions, though at the time leading the reader into a morally gray area, and his radicality of thought, were commendable for the time. Thrasymachus of Chalcedon. Thrasymachus was born around 459 BC, right around the time of Hippias and Antiphon. As with the other late sophists, almost nothing is known about Thrasymachus, other than at some point he traveled to Athens where he worked as a sophist, selling his teaching to students, most likely to wealthy ones. He is known for being included in numerous Platonic dialogues. Mostly, Thrasymachus was known for his oratory skills, being considered one of the great orators of all time. Aristotle specifically discussed him as being part of the, quote, heirs of a long succession of people whose piecemeal advances gradually made this subject, rhetoric, grow, with Tisius following in the footsteps of the first pioneers, and Thrasymachus following Tisius. Tisius? End quote. In his rhetoric and speeches, he was well known for incorporating, quote, lamentation and dwelling at length, end quote, along with, quote, rousing a crowd to anger, and then, when they are angry, soothing them with incantations, end quote. So, like Protagoras and Gorgias, Thrasymachus was a pioneer in the realm of speech, rhetoric, and debate. Any critique which could be placed on those more well-known sophists can similarly be placed here. However, he was a philosopher on top of being a sophist. Though little is known of his philosophy, we do know a few of his major beliefs. The first is that, quote, the gods pay no attention to human affairs. If they did, they would not have ignored justice, which is the greatest good for men, end quote. His notion is that God or the gods are either not omnipotent or that they simply do not care about that which they have created. His other beliefs are largely explored in various Platonic dialogues, so we will get to those when we read Plato. Euthydemus and Dionysodorus of Chios. Euthydemus and Dionysodorus were two brothers born around 430 BC, making them the newest of the sophists by a large margin. They were born on the island of Chios, the fifth largest Greek island, located in the Aegean Sea, just west of Clazomenae. At some point, the two emigrated to Thurii, Magna Graecia, located on the southern coast of modern-day Italy, just up the coast from Croton. They were exiled from here and made their way to Athens, where they practiced as sophists. Most of what we know of them stems from Plato's dialogue, Euthydemus, though they are also briefly mentioned in a few other philosophical or historical works, and we will therefore be very brief here. The two brothers were known for their comically sophistic arguments. They challenged any person to take a side on an argument in order to prove why that response was wrong, independent of the brothers' own true belief. To make their arguments, they would go on a wild form of argumentation that often relied on various debate taboos, such as slippery slopes or arguments purely based on semantics. In Plato's dialogue, after one brother asks a question, the other leans over to Plato to say, quote, whichever answer the lad gives, he will be proved wrong, end quote. This is taking the already potentially nefarious use of sophistic debate as a whole, begun by Protagoras, and transforming it into something either infantile or genuinely evil. But it is also likely that Plato was exacerbating the style of their brothers' debate to some extent to make a point about the sophists as a whole. They were also known, interestingly, for teaching martial arts. Quick notes to remember about each sophist. Protagoras, master of debate, making the weaker argument stronger, desired public funding on education, relativist. Gorgias, Master of Speech, Art of Persuasion, The Defense of Helen, Proof of the Impossibility of Being, quote unquote proof. Prodicus, Define various words, Importance of language, Advocation of virtue. Hippias, Self-proclaimed master of all topics, Favored nomos over physis. Antiphon, Proto-Stoic aphorisms, Favored nomos over physis, Higher regard of foreigners than other Sophists/Greeks. Thrasymachus, Master orator, atheist. Euthydemus and Dionysodorus, essentially satirized versions of Sophists, terrible argumentation. And a footnote, according to the first philosophers, quote, Euthydemus gains another mention by Plato at Cratylus, and crops up briefly in Aristotle at On Sophistic Refutations and his Rhetoric as well, while Dionysodorus is only mentioned by Xenophon in Memoirs of Socrates. End quote. Conclusion on the Sophists. The Sophists did present some moderately beneficial advancements to philosophy as a whole. Their advocation of virtue, their comparison between nomos and physis, their questioning of the existence of the gods, and more, all added to the wealth of knowledge that would continue to be explored up to the present day. Similarly, their advancement of rhetoric, the art of speech, and the art of argumentation all likewise provide a benefit to the world. However, where they faltered was their desire to teach the ability to win an argument rather than teaching the accumulation of knowledge. They often sold their education at a high price point, not to teach their students how to genuinely understand or further expound on the theories of those before them, but how to take the arguments presented and defeat an opponent. Their intentions may possibly at times have been good, but it is obvious how these tactics, both from an economic to a moralistic perspective, have been used and are still used for far less commendable, often evil, purposes. That's the end of the second part of the Sophists and the end of the Sophists as a whole. This all, as well, ends the entire sub-series within the philosophy substack, or the philosophy sub-page of the pre-Socratics and the Sophists. So, up next, we will be doing an episode on an introduction to Socrates and Plato until we get into, or before we get into, Plato and Socrates through Plato, I guess. And that's going to be what I believe at this point is covering the entire corpus of Plato's works, possibly including some of the ones that are attributed to him but are not thought to be him. Currently, I'm going through the entire catalog of his works. I've gotten up to Cratylus, which is like the fifth work in the catalog, and so far I'm thinking I'm just going to do all of them, but I guess we'll see when I get to it. But anyway, up next is going to be an introduction to Socrates and Plato. So until then, thank you.